I was 28 years old when this happened. I'm 43 now. And it took me a full, I would say at least probably 10 years, don't you think?
Minimum.
Before I admitted this.
Mm-hmm. Hello and welcome to the Weaponized Marriage podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Hewitt.
I'm your host, Kendra Hewitt.
And today's episode is brought to you by Topo Chico. Cheers. I'm getting wild up here.
Cheers.
So today's episode, Kendra and I decided we wanted to talk about a topic that sounds corny, but is actually really powerful. Is that, what do we say? That truth sets you free? Or, how did you put it?
Yeah, truth
sets you free. Yeah. And just, how powerfully this can change your marriage. And I think that when you're married and you especially the longer you've been married, I think you end up burying things and you end up holding things in and you end up bringing old traumas into your marriage that you never discuss. And I feel like there almost should be like a mandatory course that everybody takes.
A disclaimer?
Well, everyone should come up with a disclaimer for sure. But there should be like a mandatory course that you should take of like, here's, how your spouse is fucked up and here's how you're going to need to deal with their bullshit. But I just want to lead off by talking about how one of the things that I thought about when it comes to this topic was that when I went to chiropractic school, one of the things that I wanted to do was to become the best possible chiropractor, I could possibly be. Which to me, one of the things that made sense is I always sought out mentors. So I sought out people that were highly successful in whatever I wanted to do and to just learn from them or emulate them. That's really how I ended up in Boston. But one of the things I started to do in chiropractic school is visit doctors around the Minneapolis area. And I started to observe what they did in clinic and I would ask them questions. And what became very apparent to me was that clinicians that were like powerful leaders in their office and to their patients, they weren't just like knowledgeable practitioners that were really good at adjusting and whatnot. They were just really developed people. They were just really like sound in who they were. And you could tell they like the most successful guys had done a lot of personal development, if you want to call it that. So I took it upon myself to start to get uncomfortable and like develop skills that I saw other doctors have, like being able to speak in public or being able to, go out in the public and talk about chiropractic to unsuspecting volunteers at a screening or whatever. But the reason I say this, I started listening to like Tony Robbins. I started to listen to other people in my profession that espoused like good practices of personal development and things like that. And one of my roommates, he was sort of on the same journey. I could tell he's a very driven guy. He was a wrestler. And little guy, but just like super driven. His name is Brett. Great guy. Super successful guy, by the way. And one of the things that he did was this seminar called Landmark Forum. And Landmark Forum is it's a personal development seminar. And people that go there are seeking to sort of break out of a rut or to figure out, a path for them that is, going to help them get out of this rut or whatnot, just help you grow. And the first time I went, the form of this was, there was a teacher or an instructor, and then it was like all about group shares. And at this point I was very uncomfortable sharing in a group. So I stayed pretty quiet. And the premise of this was people were starting to share things that were coming up for them, in particular, like traumas. And people would get up and share their traumas. And I started to listen to people's traumas and, like really horrible things started coming up for people. Like people were really brave in the things they were sharing, like sexual assaults and abuse, addictions, all of that stuff, like things they've witnessed that are just god awful. And I remember sitting there thinking, I was like, wow, like like my life uh, has been easy compared to some of these people. Like I haven't witnessed nearly the horrible things these people have witnessed. And the story that I started to tell myself after the seminar was that I was okay. Like I was fine in who I was, and I didn't have any, shit to share. And I just kind of held in things about who I was that eventually led to really holding me back in my life. Right. And the reason I bring that up is that, and I shared a little bit about how kind of like my mid 30s were very difficult for that reason. But like I witnessed a marriage that wasn't healthy. Like I witnessed a
In your
marriage
parents.
in my parents. Yeah. So I witnessed like a lot of fighting, a lot of fighting about money. I'm from a family of 4 boys. So, it was just constant chaos. And like for me, that showed up in our marriage. Uh, in that I didn't really know how I was operating as a husband. I didn't know how I was operating like super dysfunctional as a husband.
Mm.
And then similarly, I didn't know how I was operating dysfunctionally, like as like a victim mindset type of person. Like I was blaming others and I was blaming circumstances for a lot of things in my life. Whether it was like, oh, the business isn't growing, or, um, oh, my marriage isn't working the way I want it to, or like we're not having the sex I want to because, and I would blame you. And I would just like look outside all the time. Um, and that was kind of the opposite of what I was supposed to take from this landmark experience, but it was because I was afraid. I was scared to share my trauma because I was worried that the people there that were sharing their like horrible stories, like mine in comparison to theirs, was like, oh, what's this guy here for? He's really like, what he's lived is like really no big deal. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I'm just kind of sharing like how that showed up for me, and that's kind of where that started. And it wasn't until I found Wake Up Warrior that I put myself in a situation where I was forced to get uncomfortable enough to share about my fears and my insecurities, really, and just to get like super vulnerable and tell people about like, not necessarily like, oh, cry about my past and my parents, right? It was more about like, how is that mindset showing up in your life, and how can you take responsibility for it? Okay, good. You've identified it. Now, how are you going to start to move forward? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's called emotional constipation.
Yeah. So I was literally emotionally constipated, I think, my whole life without knowing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I
Well,
think
that's what you modeled, right? That's what you modeled in your
oh yeah,
your family.
my family's rife with emotionally constipated men. I mean, they would all admit it too.
Mm-hmm.
My father's emotionally constipated. My brothers are emotionally constipated. My grandfather is emotionally constipated. I'm sure his father was. So it was just modeling. And I think a lot of men can relate to that. Like, my grandparents, it wasn't until like way later in life when they were almost dead that they said, like, I love you. Like my grandma, right? My
Mm-hmm.
grandma, the only time I ever heard her say I love you was like the last time we saw her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell that story.
Well, I mean, there's not much of a story, but well, I guess there is. Yeah, we went back to, well, because of COVID, I missed the death of my mother. I missed the death of my grandfather. In other words, their, ceremonies and whatnot. But I was able to go back for my grandmother's memorial, right? But it was before she died. We actually went back for a visit with Lily. And
That was our first time in Canada in probably like since COVID. So it was like 5 years since we had gone.
yeah.
And the last time we went was for your grandparents' anniversary.
Yeah, their 60th.
Right. And they had a relationship where like they'd been married for a really long time. And your grandfather really like was such a like witty, fun guy, but he depended on your grandmother so much, right?
Yeah, they had an old school marriage, and which was cute, right? But yeah, thank God my grandfather died before my grandmother, because I think he would have just like he would have needed some serious help.
Yeah.
But yeah, so my grandmother, she had since moved into her own independent living place, and she was in a pretty good place. And we got to visit her and whatnot. She had gone through a lot of health struggles with cancer, with a lot of replacement parts and whatnot.
She was a bionic woman.
Yeah, pretty much. And we got to see her, I think it was like July. And we visited her and saw her in her place, and Lily got to meet her. They got to paint nails together. And literally that was the next day, right after we left on a Sunday.
Yeah.
And then the Monday she fell, hit her head, and died like
Mhm.
the next day. So it was pretty wild.
But tell some a little bit of the emotion behind that, because I think there's a reason I'm asking you to tell this.
The emotion behind it.
Mhm.
Well, I just
Because like I said, it was almost like I'm one that is very emotionally intuitive,
Mhm.
unlike, and I had a really good read that this was the last time you were gonna see your grandmother,
Yeah, well,
right?
it's not
Now,
it's not a bad bet though.
I did not anticipate it was gonna be
A day later.
a day later, but I could feel that energy, and I remember keeping Lily busy so that you could really connect with her.
Mhm.
And we got in the car and you said, "Wow, that's the first time she really voiced
Mhm.
she loved me."
Mhm.
And it made me think about how that sharing your emotion
Mhm.
was not something that came naturally to your family
Mhm.
in the way that you showed love.
I think that that's the case for a lot of people, I think. And we just had a call with Steven, our therapist, and he shared the same thing. Like, I asked him, I was like, why is it that it requires like a crisis or a rock bottom for most people to like finally give up control of their ego and take a knee to whatever divine is in them to get them on the right path, whether it's God or whatever you believe? And he just said, like, some people just will never get the courage to, whatever it is, say, hey, son, I'm really, that when you, whatever, like, hey, I'm sorry, or I actually, I love you. And I know I haven't told you enough, whatever it is, like, people will hang on to that right until their deathbed. And
Mhm,
all the meanwhile, they could have been set free had they shared that, or just had the courage to own up to, whatever it is, whether it's, an emotion they need to share with a loved one, or whether they need to apologize or forgive.
mhm.
Right.
Yeah, and I think it's your job to start to do your own healing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, it's like you can't be mad at I think everybody at this, especially at this day and age, is like there's some sort of dysfunctional element of every single family.
Yeah, of course.
And um,
Human relationships are complicated.
I think this is not where I think we're intending this episode to go, but let's roll with it. Um, I think too is that, like, you talked about choosing mentors and at the beginning, right? Mentors and coaches.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one thing that's really hard to do in this day and age is find couples that you actually look up to
Right.
and you want to be like.
Mm-hmm.
And we have several that have been in our lives. Like, I think of Stephen and Camilla. I think about a couple couples that we really like, they're the real deal,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, but I think that the challenge is sometimes is that even those real deal couples, you don't know their struggles.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something so valuable about knowing and connecting through other people's struggles, or what we call like their dark,
Mm-hmm.
right? The dark side.
Yeah.
And
So this is what we want to talk about, right?
yeah, and kind of the idea for this episode came to me with I was on a call with our business coach, and he was leaning into like, how often do you share your dark in your content?
Mm-hmm.
And about how he was saying like the dark stuff is what really grabs these authentic, genuine connections, because you disarm people when you really share your dark shit,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it just so happened that he called on one woman and kind of pressed her on, was she sharing some of her dark stuff, and her stuff was dark. And I can totally relate to your stuff about Landmark, because I had a very similar experience. I left Landmark because I was so uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like in my early 20s, maybe, when I did that, probably similar to you. And I grew up in the Tony Robbins world, right? And a lot of, like, I was very into personal development.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my business, was like booking, speakers like that. And I can remember a couple Tony events, at not only as a participant, but events that I worked. And I had a same moment where I realized that I had like this Pollyanna type experience of life, right? And like it was like always like, look at the bright side, find the silver lining. And that's the like kind of language I would use for myself.
Mhm.
Um, and what happened is that like I grew up where I first of all, I grew up in a really wealthy area of Massachusetts, right? And one of the things that I just really started to work with in the last couple years was that like I used to hide like where I lived instead of being really proud of it
Mhm.
because I didn't want to think like how I ended up there was not your normal way that I ended up in this area. Um and I used to think that people thought like I was just like this rich bitch and like and which could not have been any further from the truth. Like if they knew my mother and the way she worked, they would still probably like I grew up with riding horses. I grew up on a really nice house across from the beach that definitely didn't look like that when we first bought it and like all of these things. And I always used to say like, "Man, I had such a great life," which made me minimize a lot of the dark side and traumas that I did have. And everyone has trauma at some level.
Mhm.
The question is like, do you have what traditional therapy calls like a big T's or little T's or small T's, right?
Mhm.
It's big traumas or small traumas. And regardless of if they're big or small, they affect you in some way. And just
Right.
like you're saying, you don't know how they show up for you.
Well, I think you create meaning. Whatever traumas occur in your life, like they imprint themselves in your nervous system, and then you create meaning. And then because we're meaning making machines, right? That's the whole takeaway from Landmark, by the way, is like you can create whatever meaning you want,
Mhm.
right? Which is why they encourage people to share their trauma because there's release involved.
Yeah.
So you're constipated, so you're stuffed this trauma, so you
Mhm.
share it to all these unsuspecting people you have no idea who they are,
Yeah.
which actually makes it easier, right, than people sharing with like a close family member or friend. And then it allows you to attach a new meaning to this event,
Yeah.
right, or this struggle or this trauma or whatever.
Yeah. And so where the idea for this episode came from this week was Ryan sent me this video and he's like, "You need to stop what you're doing right now." And we definitely have to link this video in the show notes. You need to stop what you're doing right now. And Ryan sends me lots of videos on Instagram, and I maybe
You
check
never
them.
watch them
I
anyway.
maybe check them every 3
I only
weeks.
send you funny ones. I only send you funny ones, and this one was funny.
Yeah. So he sends me this video and he's like, "You need to stop what you're doing and need to go watch this video." And it was a bunch of women standing in the woods with a woman that looked like she was legit running a seance of some sort. And what
Seance
did it
boot camp.
say? Something
It
like
was like
Angry Wives
a-
boot camp or something like
yeah,
that. And it was a bunch of women with literally, they all had individual sticks, just releasing the rage
and screaming
and
about
screaming
their
at the top
husband,
of their lungs
about
about their
about
husbands.
how much what they hate about their husband. Yes.
And I literally laughed out loud. And then I sent this to Ryan. I was like, "This is what we need to talk about this week, is
Angry
about
women about their husband.
releasing the rage."
Mhm.
Because here is like one thing that really stood out to me from by watching that. First of all, there are a lot of women that do need to do an exercise like that. But it's like, it's just not like taught to us of like, hey, part of getting in touch and releasing trauma or releasing emotion is actually releasing the shit that like you don't want to talk about
Yeah.
or the things you do not want to face or the things you don't want to share.
Mhm.
But how much power there is in doing so.
Right.
And just like I think back to like where this conversation stemmed is that like I shared even about my experience about releasing our first podcast episode together
Mhm.
and about how there were some things that I thought Ryan might share, but we hadn't discussed. And I was committed that I was going to let it come out the way that it was going to be organic for him. And about how I shared that was the first time like that he's let that dark side of him out in the open, right? And it was really freeing for me because it was like I didn't have to protect this secret anymore.
Mhm.
And that's where we kind of talk about the truth sets you free. And this is going to be like I shared with Ryan that I wanted to share this one thing that was really coming up a lot for me this week. And one of the things that like Ryan talked about in that first episode too was like thinking about how he thought like I wasn't attracted to him and like I wasn't like he didn't we weren't having the frequency of sex he wanted and the kind of sex he wanted. And I used to not be able to talk about this at all.
Mhm.
Like, I would shut the F down every time
Why?
this would come up
Why?
because I had a secret.
What was your secret?
And that secret, and I'm gonna give everybody a kind of a warning because this could trigger people. And so I'm gonna say it as eloquently as I can.
No, just
Was
say it however you're gonna say it.
something that I basically pretended really didn't happen. So I was 28 years old when this happened. I'm 43 now. And it took me a full, I would say at least probably 10 years, don't you think?
Minimum.
Before I admitted this.
Mhm.
Now get everybody on the seat of their pants, right?
Everyone on the seat of their pants.
Or on the edge of their seat.
These Kendrisms are hilarious.
Edge of
You
their
shoot
seat.
yourself in the face. I mean the foot.
Don't break my seat right now.
All right.
And that is that I was sexually assaulted when I lived in Florida. And for years, I put this out of my head. Like, I basically put it in a box, never to be opened. And just like you didn't know, like, hey, I didn't have too many big traumas, I don't really need to talk about them. You didn't know how it was affecting you. I didn't know how this was keeping this secret to myself was affecting me. And I'm not kidding you when I tell you, I literally told no one about this. And definitely not my mom, and who I have a really close relationship. I did not have one girlfriend. And the night that this happened, I was with a girlfriend and she ended up leaving. And I never ever told her that it happened, what happened. And what started happening as I read a book that really opened up this part of this woman that described the same thing happening to her. And it was that moment that I started to have this release, of like, "Oh, shit, this is coming up because, like, I need to start to deal with this."
Hmm.
And I think it was probably still a couple months later, and it really took me a lot of courage to tell Ryan this. Um, and when I did, though, I remember I started to feel very free about it. That because how it was showing up, it was really affecting our sex life at that time. Where basically I didn't know this, but I would physically like be in the act of, like having sex, and I would leave my body completely. Like, I just would not want to be there. I would think about other things. I would think about, and how it showed up for Ryan is he started to be like, "Hey, why aren't you connected to me?" And I just couldn't put my finger on describing it. Right? And it was like this huge intimacy block because I had this secret that I felt like I had to really protect. And as soon as I started talking about this with you, like, it definitely wasn't overnight. Like, it was years, probably years, and still a work in progress at times. Um, for me to really start to process some of this stuff. And um the reason that I feel like that I didn't share it, looking back, is that, like, my model of my mom at that point was like she was an emotional stuffer, right? Like, she would go on with her life and she wouldn't process stuff. Like, she wouldn't even, like, I don't still think to this day like she's really processed my dad dying. And my mom was not much older than I am when she lost, like, my dad. And just really seeing it from that perspective, I started to realize that, like, she would just avoid and or not feel emotions. And I decided that I really wanted to feel all of the emotions and go through them. And this is, like, very new for me to even be able to, like, comprehend talking about this, where it's like, hey, all of the emotions have a purpose. And so does the dark in your life, like the dark shit that happens to you. And you don't have to get stuck and you don't have to dwell on it, but you do have to process it. And I think I never used to share it too, because I was like, first of all, when it comes to the, rape, it was really, um, I was ashamed. Like I felt stupid.
Mm,
Like I was like, how did I let this happen
mm,
to me? I had a family history of other people in my life that I knew that had happened to
mm.
in different circumstances, but I really struggled to find the kind of gift in that, because it's like, who wants to really find a gift in that? Um, and I think that the reason I'm sharing this is that, like, I really think a lot of couples struggle where before you guys were a couple, there's probably stuff that has happened. While you were a couple, there's probably stuff that has happened. And I'm a real big believer in that this stuff comes up when you're ready to process. And um I feel like I'm still in the process sometimes of healing it. It comes up in different ways, but really just in that moment of you getting really raw and honest with yourself, that can you tell the truth to yourself, and also can you tell the truth to your spouse?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's heavy. I'm proud of you for well, for telling me, but then also for sharing that. I mean, obviously that's, I mean, that must be very difficult to share with everybody. As it was difficult for me to share again the truth about an infidelity that happened and why we ended up where we were. Like it was like a confluence of all these lies and
Mhm.
lies and traumas, right? Um, and meanings that we attach to what was happening or what
Mhm.
had happened, right?
Yep.
Um, so yeah, so that's been obviously it like you said, it doesn't happen overnight. The truth that I told you did not happen in all in one shot.
Yep.
The truth you told me didn't happen all in one shot. But yeah, I mean, and listen, it's been like really that all came together in like 2017, I think.
Mhm.
So what is it, 2024 now?
Mhm.
And it's only now becoming obviously more comfortable to talk about, to
Mhm.
share, and to lean into, and to obviously help other people, but then also continue to evolve as a as a married couple,
Mhm.
right? To continue to improve our sex life, to improve our intimacy, to improve our connections, you know, navigating all those things that have happened and how we've grown from that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, like, when I think about, like, why are we collaborating on this podcast? Like, why are we sharing it? I hope it is entertaining at some point.
Yeah. It doesn't all have to, it's not all going to be heavy, heavy.
Yeah, but I feel like you gotta get the shit out of the way for you to actually really see. It's like, like that concept of, like, before the dawn, the dark has to be there, right? And you gotta get the dark out. Um, and I think there's, like, not a lot of people that encourage you to do that dark work.
Yeah. It's true. A lot of it is like, well, just, put your head down and keep working hard, or, stop dwelling in the past,
Yeah.
right? Those types of things. It's like, the truth sets you free, but it's like, that's like a half truth, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
There's one piece of like telling the truth, but then also taking ownership of it, and then, moving forward and attaching new meaning, or doing the work.
Yeah. And sometimes I think that release, like, it needs to be with, sometimes it can't be with your significant other right away. Like,
Yeah.
sometimes it might be like a therapist you talk
Yeah.
to, or someone, a professional, before you go, and, like, you're not going to drop your dark on to someone else um without, like, some preparation behind it.
That's why the formula is real, raw, and relevant,
Yeah.
right? It can't just be real and raw, spitfiring truth all over the place wherever you feel like it, right?
Mhm.
And making sure that it's like it's in the right place, right?
Yeah, it has the right, like, the intention behind it matters. And, like, it's just, like, I even think about, like, back to that, what is the thing with the gold called?
Kintsugi.
Okay. So, I think that we should, like, kinda, like,
Yeah, I mean
close with
it's
that
a
there.
Japanese art of repairing broken things with gold. Like they melt gold and then put the shattered pieces back together with a solder of gold, right?
Yeah.
Which makes it even more beautiful than it was in a way, and then in some cases stronger than it was prior to being broken.
Yeah, and I think like even
So it's a metaphor for a marriage, for a person, because listen, like everyone's, we don't say like, oh, nobody's broken, right? But people are broken in their own ways, right? But it's all about how you put the pieces and put them together. Everyone's on their own journey.
Yeah.
But in a marriage, you're two imperfect people coming together, and then you have to figure out how you're going to put those pieces together to complement one another. Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
So what were you going to say about it?
Well, I was just like thinking about it's like it becomes a different piece of art, right? When you fill in the holes with the gold, or the cracks with the gold. And I was just thinking about how like that date night we went to the sushi place after Christmas, and we went to this place called Sushi. What is it called?
Sushi Sungli.
Yeah.
It's an omasaki,
and it's a private
Japanese
yeah
practice, right? So it's like a 18-course authentic Japanese omasaki, which means like my house or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
And like basically when we got in the Uber to go there, first of all, the guy's like, that place is closed. Like you got hosed. I hope you didn't pay a deposit, which we did. And it was only 8 seats, I think.
Yeah, well, it was in the back of the place that was closed. He had a kitchen in the back.
So he was somewhat kind of correct. But and it was like, I mean, when we pulled up, I was like, oh no. Yeah. We got hosed here.
It was the first time I had ever paid for a meal ahead of time. We paid for the experience ahead of time, right?
And it's in this very small kind of North Shore, north of Boston town that's very popular in the summer, but doesn't have a big like following in the winter. It's
Gloucester, Massachusetts. Yeah.
And so I was like, how can a private chef like this survive in this little like back of a cheese shop? And it was probably one of the most amazing dates we've ever had.
Yeah, it was awesome.
And one of the things that why I'm bringing that up is he talked about that that he was Japanese. Is he Japanese?
No, actually, I think he's South Korean, but
okay. And oh yeah, that's right. I think he was South Korean. He talked about how like intentionality.
Yeah.
Right. And like even the way when he took like a piece of fish that he was going to use for sushi, it was like open like chef's table, right? And you didn't know what you were going to eat, which for me was super out of my comfort zone because like I'm not that adventurous when it comes to like food, right? So he would pick up the piece of fish and it was almost like he would do like a moment of silence over this fish. And then the most amazing part I thought to watch was like as he sliced, he was methodical in like the way, like the knife he selected and how he like even
it was all methodical,
like stroked the knife. Like it was like very like the way he took like the cover off the knife and then he would go to slice the fish and it was like meticulous in the slicing, but also intentional. And it just made me like, I think, don't you remember I asked him that question? I was like, it seems like you, and he talked about like, I infuse it with love.
Yeah. And that's why you're supposed to eat it right away. So he hands it to you and you have to eat it, put it in your mouth right away in one bite.
Yes. He was like, don't chew it. Like,
no, you chew it. Just fucking chew it.
No, he was like, let it.
No, you didn't want you to like leave it there and take a nibble and leave it.
Yeah. And then put it back and like, yeah.
No, you have to like, wow, it's full of energy. That's when you get
it was full of energy. And I kind of think it made me think of that, like I said, filling in the gold and the cracks, because it's like intentionality is everything. So even when you're starting to get to this vulnerable place of sharing with your spouse, dark shit that maybe you've never told anybody, is like just like coming to the intentionality of the reason that you're sharing it is not to hurt them, make them feel bad for you.
Yeah.
I think that there's the reason that I know personally I didn't share a lot of dark shit was because I would be afraid that people would feel sympathy for me and I didn't want that. And that was my own stuff, right? And I think that just like really deciding of like, is there anything in you that is still like dark and unsettled that maybe would be really healing for you to release?
And that's I guess that's the bold in bold that it would be healing, right? So I guess a lot of people don't realize how those things are actually blocks in your life. And it could be, in your health, it could be in your relationships. It
Mhm.
could be like in your occupation or your business. It could be in your confidence or your spirituality. But yeah, those stories that we make from our experiences, they could be empowering or they could be disempowering, right?
Mhm.
And I guess the freeing piece is to be able to share that vulnerability, that shitty story or that shitty moment or that shitty event, with somebody that you trust and that
Mhm.
you feel like you can have that safe space to share that with them.
Yep.
And you do have this like lightness and this freedom that comes from that. And then like in a marriage, for example, like being able to share things that you would maybe think that would make me feel uncomfortable or that I wouldn't want to hear, but me being able to hold space to be able to receive that and then going on and then getting to the other side of it where you're able to grow from it. Right. Because I think a lot of people, they just sort of want to keep the peace. They want to keep it status quo. They want to fuck things around.
Mhm.
And in a lot of cases, it's like, well, we have our marriage is good. I know
Mhm.
you have the
Oh,
same
yeah.
good is the enemy of great. I know you have the same desire as me, as I want a great life. I want a great
Mhm.
marriage. I want greatness. I want to expand. Right.
Yeah.
And I know from experience now that like you can't expand without removing those blocks,
Mhm.
right? Without removing those things that hold you back. And I
Mhm.
think comparison is a big problem when it comes to giving yourself permission to share that vulnerability. Because if
Mhm.
you're comparing yourself to someone who's like, well, they don't like, they don't feel like, maybe it's a mentor or someone you look up to who's like more successful or has more money or a better marriage or has a nicer car than you, or whatever. It's like, oh, well, they're not as fucked up as I am. Like, or they don't, um, they don't have confidence issues because of this. So I'm just going to pretend I don't. Right. But in fact, the freedom comes from like, well, actually, I do lack confidence because of this reason. And I've identified this and I want to talk about it and I want to like break free of this.
Yeah. And then you can make a change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because now you're being intentional, just like I said, with that piece of sushi, he was being super intentional with
Mm-hmm.
the experience he created for all the people that went there. But also, too, is just like, I think that is like intentions, everything.
Yeah. Intention's everything. And then fear is what holds you
Yeah.
back.
And I think our next episode maybe should be on like, what does holding space look like?
Sure.
Because I think that's a term that's thrown around a lot. And it's like, how do you define that?
Mm-hmm.
Like you say that to most men, and men are like, what the
Well,
F does that
I
mean?
never knew what it meant,
Yeah.
not till just even recently.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, what the fuck is holding space? What the
Yeah.
fuck does that mean? Like,
All right.
just be
That's our
quiet.
next episode.
Just close my eyes and pretend I'm not hearing
Yeah.
my wife talk to me. Yeah. So how do you want to close it out?
I don't know.
It was a heavy episode.
If this resonates with you, please rate, review, and subscribe.
On that note, well, I hope you guys got some value from this episode.
We'll have to do a later one next time.
I know this is therapeutic for us. I know it's like, this has really helped improve our marriage and our communication. And we just love doing this. And yeah, feel free to reach out, if there's anything we could ever help with. But yeah, like Kendra said, keep listening, subscribe, and throw a review on there if you like it. And we're open to feedback. Speaking of holding space.
Yeah. And hopefully we'll start getting some guests, including Steven, our therapist, on.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
All right. Till
All
next
right.
time.
All right, everybody. We will see you in the next episode.